for engaging global students and families in South Carolina. Just a friendly reminder to make sure that your microphone is muted at all times to keep the background noise to a minimum. And then if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat box, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end of this presentation. So this afternoon, I am thrilled to introduce Laurann Gallito Patel. She currently works with the Carolina Family Engagement Center as the Family Engagement Liaison and Project Lead for the Midlands. Prior to her work with CFEC, she received a BA in History and Modern Languages and a Master's in Marriage and Family Therapy from Converse in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She worked with the International Rescue Committee in New York, and served newly resettled refugee students and families in South Carolina as education coordinator with Lutheran Services Carolinas. Laurann immigrated to the United States as a child and grew up as the daughter of immigrants from Italy and Venezuela, so she is excited to share information related to this topic with her incredibly knowledgeable and dedicated group of co-presenters.
Thank you so much, Martha. I really appreciate that. And good afternoon and welcome, everyone. As Martha mentioned, my name is Laurann Gallito Patel, and I work with the Carolina Family Engagement Center, and I'll be presenting with my team of co-presenters to discuss engaging global students and families in South Carolina. So first, I'd like to introduce Avery Radford from the Lutheran Services Carolina's New Americans program. He is the education coordinator for the School Impact Program and works with recently resettled refugee students and families. LSC has a statewide reach with offices in Charleston and Greenville and soon to be Myrtle Beach, but he serves in the Midlands. And then Rosa Fulmore serves on the federal programs team. She's waving there with the Charleston County School District. And she is the Title I Parent and Family Engagement Coordinator and Liaison for school-wide programs. Oops, forward, here we go. Ernesto, Bernal, and Samuel Crook work with world languages and ESOL programs through Richland 1 School District. And Ernesto serves as coordinator and Sam is the assessment specialist and school liaison. I'd also like to note Rosa, Ernesto, and Sam are also all bilingual in Spanish and English. All right, so I'll thank you all again for your interest in learning more about engaging global students and families in South Carolina. Let's dive right in. And as Martha mentioned, we'll reserve some time at the end for questions. So there are many ways that students and families from the global community arrive to the United States, and South Carolina is actually a place of incredible diversity. So to give a bit of context to our conversation, we thought it might be helpful to start out with talking through some of the terminology associated with the various immigration categories. And as we'll also discuss later, regardless of a student's immigration status or documentation, all students are eligible to receive a public education. So this section is more of a point of information to provide some foundation or expand your knowledge on this topic. And another reason why we thought it would be helpful to share this information is because some families may not have the typical forms of identification available due to circumstances related to displacement, such as a birth certificate. So many of these federally issued immigration documentation forms can serve as identification during enrollment and registration. But we'll talk about that more later on in the discussion. So here are a few terms that you may or may not be familiar with: refugee, asylee, immigrant, migrant, parolee, and unaccompanied minor. Many of these terms are quite legally nuanced, so no shame if you're having trouble kind of recalling the differences or defining these terms, but we were just curious to know, and if you'll kind of add to the chat, we invite you to do so, to share how many of these terms maybe you've come across or have heard, 0, 1, 3 or more, and just sort of share your familiarity with these terms. And if someone else can see the chat, we can share that. So again, this is a learning process. All right. So I'm seeing not familiar with asylee, okay. Some of these terms you may have heard in the news or kind of used interchangeably. So we're going to just briefly go over some of this information. I wanted to note as well, when you receive this PowerPoint or access this PowerPoint after our presentation, you can access all of these definitions via the linked image there in the right-hand corner. And that will take you to the International Rescue Committee website where these terms are defined as well. So just to briefly go over some of this terminology, refugees are forced to flee their home because of war, violence, or persecution, often without warning. And an official entity such as the United Nations Refugee Agency determines whether a person seeking international protection meets the definition of a refugee based on well-founded fear. An asylee, they're also seeking international protection from dangers in his or her home country, but they must apply for protection in the country of destination, meaning they must arrive at or cross a border, including airports as a point of entry, in order to apply. An immigrant is generally someone who makes a conscious decision to leave his or her home and move to a foreign country. And this can be intended as a permanent move or may require special permission to stay temporarily for work or school. A migrant is generally someone who moves from place to place or across a border, usually for economic reasons, such as seasonal work. And we do have some data there at the bottom. Between 2017 and 2021, nearly 3,000 individuals identified as migrant here in South Carolina. Parolee in this context is used at the discretion of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service and permits special cases temporary admission for urgent humanitarian reasons. And as Avery will likely mention later, examples may include cases from Afghanistan and Ukraine due to the present circumstances there. And then unaccompanied minor are children who are under the age of 18, arriving to the United States without an adult caregiver or legal guardian. Once in the United States, a case determination will be made to allow for the student to remain in the country or be returned to their country of origin. So if family can be identified in the US, these students may be reunited or housed with those relatives and then be allowed to enroll in school. And then one other note is that this designation may or may not apply to DACA recipients, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, often referred to as Dreamers. This is a policy that allows certain individuals who meet program requirements to be granted some protections from deportation, allow for a work permit, and generally must apply for renewal every 2 years. So next, Avery will discuss some of the countries and cultures of origin and languages spoken by students and families you may engage with in your school community.
Thank you. So we wanted to start with a little bit of kind of general background demographic information. So just some charts and things here. In the last few years, South Carolina has identified that they've received almost 130,000 international students or students from countries, cultures, or languages different from the one they're coming into. And on the right side there, you can kind of see how that has been reflected in the past few years. In general, it's been increasing, and we kind of expect for that to continue to increase. And then these families and populations do exist around South Carolina, but these particular counties are the ones that have been identified as having larger percentages and people coming into it. So if you're in one of these counties, if you work in one of these, chances are you've probably worked with some of these people groups, some of these students. But even if you're not in one of these counties, it's likely that if you haven't already, you might get somebody from one of these different backgrounds. So just some more general information as far as the languages that are represented in South Carolina. This might be kind of surprising. Maybe oftentimes we don't view South Carolina as a very diverse place, but it is. We have 74 plus languages represented as first languages in families who have come to our state. The largest here is Spanish, but you can see several others from various parts of the world exist. And these can be helpful kind of to be aware of, especially in your area, just to kind of have an idea of maybe what to expect or people to partner with that can help with interpretations and translations. But even just having that cultural component to kind of begin assisting families when they're first coming in. So a little more specific background information. As far as larger places of origin or people groups that are pretty common in certain counties and areas in South Carolina, we wanted to kind of hone in and focus on some of those. These numbers here are only representative of individuals who have been resettled in South Carolina through refugee resettlement. So this won't reflect some of the other statuses that we mentioned before, like migrants and immigrants and people like that, but just people who've come as asylee seekers, refugees, unaccompanied minors, and similar statuses. So these two are ones that have been coming to South Carolina for a while. So the first of these would be the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chances are, again, if you're in one of those counties, you've had some Congolese clients. We wanted to kind of take a second for a few of these, just to kind of hone in on a few key cultural components that we've found working with schools that have been helpful in understanding cultures and how to assist these families coming in. So this one and the next one in particular, even though we had a lot of families coming from these areas, the diversity in people groups and languages and cultures is really high. So to kind of be aware of a family who is Congolese or coming through the DRC, they could have a different language from their neighbors. They could have different cultures. They could come from people groups that maybe don't even prefer to interact with each other. Similarly, Burmese clients, this is actually this is the biggest group of people that have come to South Carolina in recent history and the US in general. And again, kind of similar to the DRC, there's a lot of diversity in people groups. A lot of different tribes come from this area, and almost everyone has their own language and own culture. So it can be a little tricky to navigate sometimes, but just being even aware of those differences and that diversity can help assist those families as they're coming in. Our next two might be the ones that you are beginning to experience more and might even have a lot of questions about right now. These are the Ukrainian and Afghan families that are coming in. Probably you've had some families and students come from Afghanistan in the last year or so. And if you haven't already, maybe you will start to get some Ukrainian students. Like we mentioned before, these are both considered typically what is a parolee status, which is kind of a temporary emergency status allowed to these people coming out of hardships into the United States. And we recognize that these might be newer populations coming in, and we have some links attached to some of these slides that once you receive this information after, you can kind of go into more detail on some of the background websites we've added, but just a few things that we found are helpful to be aware of, especially with our Afghan students, is a lot of the language considerations. Place that they come from, there's two main languages. There's Dari and Pashto. And the people groups that speak these languages oftentimes don't interact with each other. They might do that more now that they're in the US, but just that language and cultural aspect, kind of being aware as they come in, it might be easy to assume sometimes maybe it's an Arabic speaking family. So if they're from Afghanistan, probably they are not. And then with this group of students and the ones we'll talk about next, there's a lot of cultural considerations that go into things like religious practices and how that looks day to day. So we can kind of go to that next slide. So while there are some differences from different places and cultures, these three areas, or these three places of origin, Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, have a lot of religious practices that can be similar, that kind of play out in the school system. Things like religious dress, and knowing how to, I guess, make room for that in schools. Things like food restrictions, which can be a little complicated at first to navigate. And then even things like daily prayer, fasting, and religious holidays. And again, we have some links kind of embedded into this for you to kind of explore outside of the presentation. And then probably the largest by far place of origin that you'll receive students from different cultures, languages, or just education systems in general in South Carolina would be Latin America. And we kind of grouped in the Caribbean here as well. This is obviously a really big area. And we kind of wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. One of which is it might be easy to assume that families coming from these areas, this place of origin, might have a lot of similarities. And this could be true, but there's also a lot of differences that can come. So when receiving students from these areas and these places of origin, being aware of the cultural differences that can exist, the different hardships that could come about in them coming, but even the language in some ways. While a lot of these students will speak Spanish as a first language, there's other languages that can be represented, like French, different Creoles, and things like that, if we're from the Caribbeans. But even from Spanish-speaking majority countries, you could have families whose first language is Portuguese, or even a native indigenous language. So again, sometimes being aware of cultural differences can be helpful, and it can help create a welcoming environment for those students and families. But any sort of over-assuming might also create more barriers. So to kind of be aware of that on a case-by-case basis. So I know there's a lot of information. As I said, we have more things embedded in this presentation that once you receive it after this, you can kind of look through that. We have some things on more considerations for Afghan families, for Ukrainian families. But we wanted to kind of move away a little bit from the really information heavy side and just kind of give you an insight into some of the people that we've gotten to work with and what they're able to share about their experience coming to South Carolina. So I won't read all of this. I've highlighted a few pieces from this short story just to kind of point out some things that we found impactful. So this is a mother who came first to South Carolina, resettling in the United States. And in this, she just really talks about the difficulties and almost hopelessness that she felt being in a refugee camp, seeing her children not be able to connect with people, not receive an education, but that when they were finally able to be resettled in South Carolina, that hopelessness completely changed to a hope and an excitement for her and for her students. And parts of these highlighted sections, it just really shows that the thing that was impactful for that family was the one-on-one, the caring of the teachers, and just that sense of actually being seen and valued by the school system. Our next one is actually a student. So this student came to the United States, came to South Carolina schools directly as a high school student. And oftentimes we can find, especially with the high school students, the older students, that this transition can be particularly difficult. Just a lot of cultural and language barriers that they have to overcome in a really short amount of time. But just another short experience here that shows it was difficult. There were a lot of barriers, but having teachers that were invested, having teachers that were willing to take time and do one-on-one help with a student allowed them to not only succeed and accomplish their education, but also to pursue higher education afterwards. And then another similar quote to our first one is another mother who came to the United States. I think that something interesting about this is just the cultural differences that can exist between different areas, where students coming from their home country might experience something completely different. And in this example, they didn't feel like they were valued in their schools in their home country, but coming here, that same thing, the care and the one-on-one attention that they would receive, not only helped the student, but made them excited to go to school, which we love to hear. And I think we just have one more, another student, again, who went straight into high school. they share some of the some similar difficulties trying to overcome those barriers of culture and English. But what's interesting in this one is they also focus more on the potential of feeling isolated and the potential of being alienated because they're not able to connect. But some of the extra resources provided by the school, like events or chances to meet other families or students who are going through the same thing, is what helped the student begin to feel encouraged and motivated. And again, not only did they successfully complete their education, but they've also gone on to pursue higher education. So I hope that some of these have just kind of given a small glimpse, maybe you'll get the chance to read them more later, of just what this a small impact of teacher attention and one-on-one help can do for some of these students. So I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Rosa. She's going to talk a little bit more about education engagement.
Thank you, Avery, so much. It is great to be able to share this. As an honor, actually, as a former ESOL student and then as a former ESL teacher, have experienced this firsthand. And it also gives me great pride to be able to share this opportunity with my colleagues as a first-generation Dominican American. So it's always great to hear what we're doing to help students like myself that have gone through certain situations, whether it's of our own choosing or not, but that we are able to receive support and how you are able to help our families to feel welcome and engaged. So my considerations here, something to keep in mind as you're working with families, is also to remember that proceed with cautions in some situations. Not all our global or international students and families are multilingual. That's one point to consider. Also, we want to remind you that all students are eligible to receive a public education regardless of their immigration status. That is the law, that it's what we need to do for our students. Also wanted to point out another consideration, something to keep in mind, is that families may not fall under the immigration categories that we have listed, or maybe they have a mixed status. So just remember that as you're working with families and students. And last is to remember that be mindful of the humanizing terms or labels that may hinder your future building relationship, trusting relationships with families and students. Terms like illegal alien or some other terms that may be of concern and may raise flags for the families that we're working with. So please be sensitive to people's situation as you are working to build those trusting relationships and strong partnerships with our families and students. Next, please. So we wanted to point out, as I just mentioned earlier, that all students have the right to public education. There are several laws that cover this. We're highlighting and has been linked to information on the slide for the Plyler versus Doe of 1982, the law that basically is providing free access to public education for all students, regardless of their immigration status. Also be mindful that all children are entitled to accommodations that may be particular to our populations to assist them with registering specially at school. And also sometimes you may have to provide other accommodations, kind of like interpreter, translator, anything that can help and limit or eliminate those obstacles to registration and making sure that our students are enrolled on time at their school of attendance. Also, just keep in mind as well that as far as the right to education is concerned, the documentation that is provided by our families may vary and also may be different types of forms because we have several people coming from all over the world. So they may not resemble exactly what we have in the United States, but we basically are looking to see that they're a valid issue, federally mandated, or any type of valid documentation identification. So just be mindful as you're working in the process of registering our global students that you are working with the families to be able to ease the process for them. Next slide, please. As I mentioned just a moment ago, we also wanted to provide you with some resources when it comes to language access and interpretation. The U.S. Department of Education and Justice have provided some fact sheets and information that have been linked to this presentation. And these information documents are available in several languages. So please feel free to download the information. And we are hopeful that the information is useful to you as you work with our global families and students. Next slide, please. As far as some resources from South Carolina and also from our State Department of Education, we wanted to provide you with links to the Parents' Right to Know. So just like any other parent that is a part of our education system, parents from global families are entitled to know what are their rights, whether the teachers are certified, are they teaching in their correct area? All those items are highlighted in the Parents' Right to Know, and it has been linked in the slide, as well as the parents need to know as well their parents' rights in IEP or 504 plan in meetings. So some information from the Family Connection South Carolina is available to you on this slide, just to kind of help you as you're navigating those meetings or as you're navigating your work with families and students. Next. And as you're considering funding sources, we just wanted to point out here that basically, if you're working with whether it's our global families or any students, there are certain funding sources. We deal a lot in my world, in my office, with the Title I Part A, and also just be mindful the Title I has also Part C for our migrant students as well. So then we also have Title III, which I'm going to turn over to Sam to give us some more details on Title III. Thank you, Sam.
Yes, thank you, Rosa. So I will go ahead and just be very brief with Title III Part A. It is similar with Title I, but it's another federal program that is just kind of a different pot of resources targeted specifically for, at the time it was written for English language learners. Now we may call them multilingual learners. But the key phrase coming from our funding for Title III is that these funds are going to be used in schools and districts to supplement instructional activity and not supplant, i.e. do not create brand new programs specifically for these, but you are supplementing an instruction with these funds. And with that, I believe we're going to go on to maybe some specific activities or strategies that can be used and implemented when we are working with our multilingual families within our school buildings, but kind of also district-wide and community-wide. And yes, you can go ahead to the next. So as you can see, I've created a brief little chart here for with our multilingual families in the middle. And I do want to point out, I loved all of our definitions for our global families that may be immigrating here to South Carolina and enrolling in our schools. But I'm going to talk about them in a context of our multilingual families as a whole. And I also want all those that are working with our families to kind of understand that they're not all immigrating here to the United States. I actually just ran a brief report this morning of our multilingual learners in our school district, and of approximately 2,300, the birth country of nearly 1,800 of those was the United States. So I know, Avery, you often call your program the New Americans program. And I just want all of our teachers, all our educators, all our school staff and administrators to understand that we have our New Americans, and that many of these multilingual students are already, in fact, by birth, Americans as well. So coming to this particular chart, we often have the assumption that as educators, we're kind of operating in our silo, and that our job, our responsibility is grades, attendance, and academics. What goes on before 8 a.m. or after 4 p.m. is not necessarily in our realm. But I really wanted to debunk some of that, and that we are, as family engagement specialists, we should be addressing native language and cultural support, what kind of welcoming learning environment they have, any community resources, making those connections, what legal rights and also healthcare rights that our multilingual families may need. And please note that this is not a flow chart that goes particularly one direction or another, but these are all realms that are interconnected and that we can use to support our multilingual families. So I am going to touch a little bit on each one of these at a time. So Laurann, you can go ahead to the next slide, please. Just in the realm of education, I wanted to start out with what are our what in Richland 1, what we've designated as our program values for our multilingual learners. And number one, first and foremost, is these I have ELs, but multilingual learners are everyone's kids. They are not simply the responsibility of an ESOL or a multilingual specialist in the building, but everyone from administrators to database specialists, registrars, front office staff, and especially content teachers, that they are just like any other student within your building. Our multilingual students are the responsibility of everyone in that building. And I mentioned especially the content teachers. For number 2, we absolutely focus here on Richland 1 on the aspect of co-teaching of our multilingual specialists collaborating with content teachers, planning as a group for the success of our English language learners. And also focusing on taking everything with an asset-based approach. So not thinking about what a student may fault in terms of familiarity with our school environment or culture or even language, but what assets do they bring with them? And I'm thinking in terms of perhaps family resiliency, dedication, creativity, and really taking on that asset-based approach. So as family engagement specialists, what can we do? Or I would really kind of highlight what we have done here in our district to really address some of those other realms and the students as a whole and families as a whole. So we can go to the next slide, please. All right, in terms of native language and cultural support, this is just one example of an event that we put on last year where we are encouraging the use of the home language and that bridge to a home culture. It actually kind of saddened me a little bit when I was in a presentation earlier this morning to hear, it was striking from Lydia Carnesale, that a student entering kindergarten whose home language is not English, that by the time they reach high school age, nearly 80% of them have lost the ability to speak in their home language. So here in the multilingual learners program, we absolutely advocate for biliteracy and bilingualism. So having students and their families have the ability to, we're not only out here to produce English speakers, but multilingual students as well. So at this particular event, we brought in world language teachers that have been in our district for quite some time and have experience in raising multilingual children and kind of talk about some of their strategies, some of their success stories. We absolutely brought in a lot of literacy, both in English and in Spanish, because that was our primary audience was Spanish speakers, but to really encourage the use of that native language at home, as well as a lot of resources that in fact were developed during COVID that may be learning at home strategies that can be practiced without the, with the entire family. So additionally, we also have in the same building where we have our International Welcome Center is the adult ed office. So we feel very fortunate to have that very close connection where if families may be coming into our office to register a school-age child for school, that we can also offer the opportunity to parents who may be limited English proficient to improve their English speaking abilities through the Office of Adult Ed. All right, you can go to the next one. All right, also in order to educate a child and engage with family, first and foremost, we need to have healthy families. What we often see as a detriment is a lot of our multilingual families don't necessarily have access to affordable health care, or they may be waiting to the last minute where a problem may be emergency room urgent to go and actually seek medical care. So with that in mind, we really wanted to try to bring healthcare providers to a central location within the district to show their availability, support, and services for our multilingual families here in the district. So we brought in everything from dentists and preventative care organizations to pharmacies offering COVID vaccines to, we were very blessed to have Eau Claire Health Cooperative bring one of those medical buses outside so that families could get blood pressure screenings, glucose checks, things like that during the event. And we were also very fortunate enough to have the chair of the Hispanic Business Group from Prisma Health come give a keynote address, really focusing on preventative care and healthy habits that may be able to help families avoid any long-term problems as far as health. So of course, just say we need to make sure our families and students are healthy themselves before we can really focus on the learning that may take place in the classroom. Next. All right, and in a similar vein, and especially with all the different definitions that were shared with us earlier in the presentation, a lot of our new global families may experience some confusion or not know where to turn in regards to their legal rights. At the basic fact of this is our multilingual families are our community members. And as community members, they have rights, and they have specifically defined civil rights as well in the eyes of the U.S. government. So the purpose of this particular event, we titled it Know Your Rights, Know Your Community, was really to bring in our families and organizations that will offer that support, that can offer that support legally. We reached out to the South Carolina Bar Association, and they put us in touch with a bilingual immigration attorney who was able to speak and answer some questions for many of our families. We also reached out to Appleseed Legal Justice Center. It's an education and policy advocacy group, and obviously works very closely, very often with some of these multilingual families. But I also thought what may have been one of the most important groups that we brought in for this particular event were many representatives from the Richland County Sheriff's Department. We often know a lot of our multilingual families with mixed status, unknown status, may be timid when it comes to dealing with the law enforcement community. And unfortunately, that may often open them up to be victims of crimes and unreported crimes. So we really sought to bring bilingual officers from the Sheriff's Department into this space and really kind of have a conversation with our families about acting in terms of service as opposed to a punishing group for anything. So that was very beneficial for us to have in these. But yeah, so we can go on to the next slide, please. All right. Also, we have been fortunate enough here in this conference to really be exposed to a lot of community service organizations that can engage with our families. And this we did during COVID, when it was not possible for us to bring large groups of people into school buildings and not possible really for just a lot of greater movement throughout the community. So we reached out to several community organizations and really asked them just to give us a very brief commercial, if you will, of who they are and what they do. And we condensed this all into a catalog of resources, a video catalog of resources that we were able to share with our multilingual families. We did have one with outside community organizations. And then also we reached out internally within our district to show these families that what can we offer as a school district. And this was everything from offices of adult ed, family engagement specialists coming in, let's see here, early childhood education, special ed services, to really show that these resources are here and available for you and how to get in contact with them. So really just throughout, organizations throughout the Midlands that were offering a variety of services and support. And for us on the ground level, I think one of the most important things that we can do is create that welcoming environment that a parent and a student can see on a day-to-day basis when they enter that school building. So what that looks like for us is continual professional development on a regular basis that is updated and reinforced regularly directed towards a lot of that front office staff and main content teachers. So this is where representatives from our office talk about things that they can do physically within the school space to create a welcome environment, whether that be translating signage into various languages, simply having a welcome sign in various languages, simple translation tactics, or making them knowledgeable on translation policies and procedures within our district. So how they can either set up appointments with a certified interpreter for some of those I guess more important school meetings versus simple communication when somebody walks in that may need to register a child or withdraw a child early for the day, and the person does not speak English and the front office staff does not speak another language. How to navigate very simple translation service apps and things like that. But really, especially with the content teachers as well, having them collaborate with our office as well as their multilingual teachers to co-plan and co-teach and ensuring the student success. So a lot of this all kind of does come back to what we are doing within the school building in terms of education. And I've heard this said in several presentations, several sessions today, is simply building relationships. So this was a slide that we would often introduce to teachers, to our ESOL teachers at the very beginning of the school year, and ask them to share with content teachers and other staff. But I think it can really work for anyone who's working in a family engagement capacity. These questions were addressed specifically first for a student, but I think we can broaden it to the wider family. So what might we want to know, and how do you get to know that? Once you do know this information about your families, what are you doing with it to learn more, and with whom are you sharing it? So these are not necessarily questions that we expect answers to immediately, but more reflection questions that you can continually reinforce and re-ask yourself to determine what kind of relationship you are building with your families, and how you are using that to get them to be engaging partners. All right, and yeah, and this was just kind of a final slide that I had there that kind of brings everything together, to understand that we are working not specifically or not only within the realm of education, but as a larger community to holistically address a student, and not just the student, but their family as well, to get to know them, support them, and ensure that they have a successful learning environment. All right. Did we want to wrap up with kind of just our summary of some promising practices that we had? Yeah. Okay, so I will go ahead and say that this, no, you are fine.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute, but it was not letting me. But
No,
yeah, go
I think
ahead.
this is great because
this is just sort of a summary.
That time period. But this is kind of a summary slide of what a lot of our next slides had. And you know, the next slides expanded on each one of these points, but really just to kind of wrap up what may be some promising and best practices to keep into consideration when we are engaging with new global families, is that each and every family is unique. Just because they come from the same country does not necessarily mean that they understand each other's cultural practices or even speak that same language. And of course, they're not coming from the same circumstance. Processing documentation is important. We know that's important for our district registrars, but that documentation can look different depending on a person's individual circumstances. The American education system is and can be a cultural shock for many of these new families and students. Understand that, respect that, and make sure you're doing whatever it may be in your power to create that welcoming environment. But we absolutely encourage educating yourself on learning at least a little bit of a culture of a new student that you may have from a new location you may not know about. Don't focus on what students cannot do, whether it's they do not understand. the culture or the schedule, or they do not speak the language, but think about what they are bringing with them. In many cases, a lot of these students have overcome severe hardships and trauma. So again, that resiliency is already in place in many of these students, and you can be guaranteed that that resiliency will persist. Be creative in terms of communication. I know we've talked about various apps and things in various sessions today, but it can be simple things as body language and a smile on your face. So let's see here. Yeah, communication.
We have about 5 more minutes if you all want to take some questions once you wrap up.
That's great.
The last point, sorry, Sam, I went forward in the slides just to show everyone the expanded version of these bullet points. But the last was that there may be additional supports or resources that are needed for students, whether those are like the older high school students who are newly resettled and engaging with the American school system for the first time as older students. Students are eligible to be enrolled in high school until age 21, I believe, is still the law. And so many families don't know that, but there may be additional supports that are needed to ensure that those students, who oftentimes need to start as first-year high school students, feel supported as they move through, as well as the resources that we shared for students with disabilities that would, require additional interpretation for 504 and IEP meetings. And remember also that many of these circumstances that we described earlier can impact a student as far as the trauma that they may have experienced before coming into your classroom or into your school community. So being mindful of the emotional and mental resources or needs that that student may also need to access. So thank you so much. I'm going to just go forward here and take some questions if there are any. We've also included some resources here at the end, as well as a listing of our organizations. All of these images are linked to our organization websites, and then I've included our contact information here to contact us by phone or email. Are there any questions with the time that we have remaining? Thank you all so much for being here at the end of a long day and being an audience to what we've shared today. Any questions? And just in case I'm not seeing them.
I don't see any questions right now in the chat box. If anyone has any questions, you can place those in the chat and I'll make sure they get to the presenters.
Yes, and as I mentioned, we have our contact information here. So if you think about this later and have questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out to us. We are all very, as you can tell, very dedicated and excited to share this information and passionate about this topic and serving families from around the world. So thank you all again for listening, and feel free to reach out to us, as I said.
And thank you to all of our presenters today on a great presentation, a lot of useful information for our participants. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This is a reminder that we will have closing remarks in the main room after this session closes out. Thank you, everyone.